When Boz went into the studio to do Silk Degrees and working with these great collaborators, he was just treating it like another album, another project, songs to tackle, hopefully a good experience, but not necessarily expecting this huge, crazy jump. What I loved getting to interview him for this book to reflect upon his experiences working with Boz, just that he has such a positive remembrance of that, and that he was young and coming up at the time, and it was one of his biggest projects at the time. It kind of broke him out a bit more than he had been. They won a Grammy.
It's John Bowden from Rock History Music, a very special guest today. We look at one of my favorite albums from the 70s. It really made a difference. I remember stopping in my tracks, maybe you did too, when you first heard Lowdown by Boz Scaggs. Like, the real fans knew him from his days maybe with Steve Miller and his albums before Silk Degrees. But there is always that defining moment in anyone's career that works hard, that digs deep, where you get that album you deserve. And Boz Scaggs had a few of those, Silk Degrees being the biggest one. Our special guest is Jude Warne. The Music of Boz Scaggs is her brand new book. It's very interesting. I learned a lot, which is what these books are for. True fans should go, I didn't know that. Jude Warne, Silk Degrees, and a lot more on Rock History Music. He blended soul, rock, and sophistication without breaking a sweat. Boz Scaggs was always one step ahead of the trends. Scaggs was born William Royce Scaggs on June 8, 1944 in Canton, Ohio. He spent part of his youth in Texas, where he met Steve Miller at St. Mary's School in Dallas. The two quickly formed a musical bond that would lead to them playing together in several bands, including the Steve Miller Band in the 60s. After parting ways, Scaggs embarked on a solo career that saw him blending rock, blues, and soul. His breakthrough came in 1976 with the album Silk Degrees, which peaked at number 2 and featured the number 3 hit Lowdown. This would become his signature song, and a song that has easily stood the test of time. Then came Lido Shuffle, which peaked at number 11. At the Grammy Awards in 1977, Lowdown won the Grammy for Best R&B Song. The album was also nominated for several other Grammys. Silk Degrees also featured several musicians who would go on and form the band Toto. Keyboardist David Paich, who wrote or co-wrote 6 of the 10 tunes on the album. Bassist David Hungate, and legendary drummer Jeff Porcaro. The album not only solidified his place in music, but would also become a defining record of that era. And it sold over 5 million copies in the US alone. Scaggs continued to release successful albums through the years, including Down To Then Left, the follow-up to Silk Degrees. That one went double platinum and peaked at number 11 on the album's chart. Then came the number 9 record, Middleman, featuring the hit Breakdown Dead Ahead, which peaked at 15, and the number 17 hit, JoJo. Scaggs also scored a tune from the Urban Cowboy soundtrack, Look What You've Done to Me, a number 14 hit. His smooth voice and sophisticated style certainly has kept him in the spotlight ever since the 70s. He explored various musical styles, from blues to jazz, and his legacy is defined by his genre-crossing talent, his influential work with Steve Miller, and his enduring solo career that left an indelible mark on rock and soul music. Author Jude Warne was born and raised in Manhattan to rock and roll loving parents, instilling a passion of music and the power of rock in this young lady. She was always a strong advocate of high-quality music and art criticism. She cites Lester Bangs and Greil Marcus as major influences. Her writings have appeared in The Vinyl District, Film International, The Observer, Journal of Popular Music and Society, Film Masters, and Sense of Cinema. She has served as a music columnist for Red Paint Hill Journal. Warne earned a BA in Cinema Studies in 2011 and an MA in Humanities and Social Thought in 2015. She's the author of a 6-volume teen fiction series, Crushing, and the authorized biography of America, the band. Her new book is Lowdown, the Music of Boz Scaggs. That's what we're talking about today. When you talk about Steve Miller, and, I look at Steve and Boz, they're young. Like you had said in many interviews, it's Steve's name on the moniker. It's basically him. Randy Meisner told me the same thing. Randy says, I decided to do that last tour with the Eagles. It wasn't fun, but, even at the time, I knew we were stupid. We were talented, but we were, So Steve and Boz, how do you look at the fact that they're going at each other a little bit near the end there?
Well, I see it as these two incredible solo artists in one band trapped together, and they're meant to be, leading their own band, each of them. And of course, Steve was already leading, Steve Miller Band, but I think Boz was meant to be in that spot too. And of course, towards his departure, he was feeling that desire and impetus, I think, and his songs and talent spoke to that, of course. So I wasn't surprised to read about that. There had to be a way to exit. But they both speak so highly of each other now from what I've read. And even back then in early, interviews in the 70s, Boz talks about how they were kindred spirits and into the same American blues stuff from when they were teenagers, and they still had that connection together. They just had different paths to go on. But I find it so fascinating as a music fan and a music historian, that they were both in the same band for a while. I love that.
Talking to David Page, I find that I forget who he is. I mean, and Marty, his dad, and the band. Sometimes when I talk to him, I've interviewed him many times, I just kind of forget. Like, because he's so unassuming and he's just like one of those guys that has a passionate for music. What was your take on David?
Yes, as you were saying, he's very humble, and very, all about the music each time, each project, that same energy and the talent, bringing that to each opportunity. So he does come across as humble a bit. But what I loved, getting to interview him for this book to reflect upon his experiences working with Boz, just that he has such a positive remembrance of that, and that he was young and coming up at the time, and it was one of his biggest projects at the time. It kind of broke him out a bit more than he had been. They won a Grammy, and then he went on to do Toto shortly after, and kind of around the same time. So it has a nice positive spin and memory, and with the Toto guys who I spoke to, like David. So I love that.
There's a certain angle, and everyone I've talked to in the last maybe 3 months, Rush, Pink Floyd, they do all these books, and they don't necessarily talk to the artist. They're a music fan, they talk about the music. And it's a fresh take with getting the people who are around it and getting that side of the story, because sometimes if you get it from the artist, it's kind of like a documentary that they made themselves. So how did that feel for you?
Yes, I know what you mean when it's just the artist himself talking. There's definitely a lot of ego editing that goes into it, understandably, as it would be. But yes, with this project, I did get to talk to several collaborators who Boz worked with at different points in his career, like David Page, and then three other Toto members, Steve Lukather, Steve Porcaro, and David Hungate, which was so exciting because they were involved in the Silk Degrees era, which is Boz's most successful part of his career. But I also spoke to some people from early on, like Jim Peterman, who was in the original Steve Miller Band lineup with Boz at the time, and Tracy Nelson, who worked with Boz in those same early years in the late 60s. So that was a nice way to incorporate different people who were there into the writing. Even though my writing, as you know, is generally more, it analyzes the music, it kind of sticks to the records, but I wanted to put some voices in there. So I was happy with how it turned out.
A couple of years ago, I talked to Louis Shelton, who worked
Oh.
on the album, but I was talking to him about Seals and Crofts, and then I started doing more research. And I went, of course, Last Train to Clarksville, all this stuff he did. But he had said something about Boz, and you give me your opinion. He said Boz was at a point where with Silk Degrees, he says he was open. He was it's like a little bit more than he knew before. He said, what happens if I press this? Whatever, a good idea is a good idea no matter where it came from, kind of vibe. What was your take on Boz at that time?
Yes, I think there wasn't that extra external pressure at this time, which could potentially be damaging to an artist or just restrictive. But I think because Boz was treating this like just another record, like you're saying, he was able to be more open-minded / experimental with working with this new collaborator, David Page, who he hadn't really written with before, and just bringing this kind of new open attitude to it, which I think that fresh sound is still relevant today on the record. When I put it on, it has that modern sound, even though it was from decades earlier.
Lido Shuffle, a certain Magneto titled song. Was it Lido Shuffle that was inspired by Wings? Joe English and Jeff Porcaro.
Yes, it was one of the Venus and Mars tracks, Magneto and Titanium Man, that David Page was listening to while he was working on the Silk Degrees record, for sure. So that sound kind of crosses over, I think. And it's funny because Lido Shuffle, I think the title of theoretically this kind of constructed dance number is not really mentioned directly throughout the song, which is funny, but it has this other line of this narrative line going on. But I love that track, and it's one of the catchiest on the record, arguably.
What do you think of Jeff's playing on specifically that record?
And and as you know, reading the book begins chapter one with talking about Jeff and his musical power, just in terms of how it affected others who he worked with, and how he was this great catalyst a lot of times for bringing other artists together to work together. And that was the case with bringing Boz together with David Page, who was his best friend, of course, and a musical partner. But I'm just such a fan, as many people are, of Jeff's drumming and the commitment that he brought to each recording, and kind of putting the music first over himself a lot, and just adapting to whatever was called for at the session. And the Silk Degrees sessions had this great demand and openness and opportunity, like we were talking about, for trying different things and for really building sounds out into these new places. So I think the power of his drumming really showcases itself on that record. And I'm just such a mega fan of his stuff. So.
I see so many remnants, and it's been said it's like a worn out cliche of you can sense Toto on this record. And honest, I mean, it comes upon it honestly, obviously, but there's so much Toto in this, because Toto could have gone that way, and you sense it in earlier songs, especially on the first album, and even further than that, but especially on the first album, where Page wrote. Well, he was the chief songwriter of Toto in the early days, right? Page, I was looking at the back cover of Neil Diamond. That's why I brought him up. I was looking at the back page of Neil Diamond's Serenade, which was one of my favorite Neil Diamond albums, and I remember going, right, he was down. I go, David Page, and then you start digging more, and you see the richness of how much, especially with his dad, but how much an artist becomes. And I think Boz was like that too. There was something about them. They were like 1,000 years old when they made that record. There was something like, you don't have to get all the lessons. You do the work, you get in the rooms, that's nice, but not everyone retains what they're supposed to retain for whatever reason.
I quote that idea a lot in the Boz book about how he brings this timeless classic quality to whatever project he's working on. And it does kind of transcend the era in which it's made, and like you're saying, it projects kind of like this old soul quality, wiser than their years and stuff, which all good writing does, I guess. But
sure,
I think Boz's love of ancient American blues and stuff that has the timelessness too, from when he was a kid, having that love for that goes through the music that he always worked on. So I feel like he has that power on those mid '70s records too, even though they weren't too bluesy necessarily, but
I went and bought Lowdown, which, by the way, was a second single, as you know. I'm going, they didn't lead with Lowdown?
I think it's less commercial somehow initially. It has like a bit of this underground dance feel to it that melodically, I don't know if I would pull that out immediately, but of course, hearing it now, it has such a catchy sound to it, and I'm glad it found its way out of the album into the singles, and it brought the album more attention as it deserved.
Down 210 Left, I found that I didn't find that album had one bad track on it. Lowdown, Silk Degree as well. Slow Dancer, I went back to it, and not as much, but I remember a lot of people went back, right? What do you do when you discover Elton John in 75 with Captain Fantastic? You go back to Caribou and Honky Chateau and Tumbleweed. You do that. And luckily, you could do that with Boz Scaggs, but a lot of people were surprised, I think, because they went, wow, this guy really came from the blues. What order did it come for you? What order was it for you?
Well, I first came to him with the Silk Degrees record. Georgia was the first song I really tuned in to, that I just really loved, the narrative buildup of that, and it's such an exciting song. And then I went to the rest of that record and just couldn't stop playing it for a while because it's pretty perfect. And then going backwards, as you're saying, into where he had come from, it does get very bluesy the earlier you go back, especially the first U.S. release he had that Jan Wenner produced from '69, I believe it was, with just his name, Boz Scaggs. But it's very Lonely Dime is on there, and he worked with the Muscle Shoals rhythm section, Dwayne Allman guitar stuff. So it's very different in a way from like the mid '70s stuff that he's most remembered for, generally speaking, nowadays. But that's what I find so fascinating about him as an artist, just this kind of a musical journey he goes on. And then if you take it all the way to current days, he kind of goes all the way back in a full circle with the recent trilogy of records that he did, a lot of blues covers, and really true to himself, as I see. think it's his tremendous vocal ability that really carries him through all of these genres. Like if you look at what you're talking about, the standards albums from the early 2000s, I guess that was when he did two of those covers of mostly the Great American Songbook, maybe some bossa nova stuff too in there, but it really showcases the tremendous ability of his voice to kind of take on any narrative point of view, any genre, and it's kind of like an instrument, like in a great jazz solo, a jazz recording or something. Some of his vocal lines on those records particularly really stand out. So I think that's one of the consistent themes. If you look at even his very early stuff from the Jan Warne produced album in the late 60s up until now, he has this incredible control over his voice and so much emotion in there. But it does let him go to these different genres, which is great.
Boz got that software where he can say no.
Yeah, I think that kind of attitude speaks to the authenticity that's on all of these records. He really doesn't suffer fools and doesn't, he's not brought around by record labels or anything, arguably, especially if you look at like the hiatus he took in the early 80s after Middleman came out. Another artist could have been pressured to just do it again, and I'm sure that the record company was pushing for that with the success of that trilogy of records and stuff, and he needed to take some time away. So I feel like the evidence of that characteristic is throughout his years, which I really admire because it's a rare thing in the pop world anyway.
David Hungate, he's on Middleman as well. What's your take on him? He's such in the pocket. Like, I know he left to go to Nashville. I communicated with him a little bit, but you talked to him for this book, right?
Yes.
What was your take on David?
It was great to speak with him. He's very to the point, very on the ball with answering about working with Boz, and he had nothing but positive memories of kind of like the other Toto guys, just at that point in their career when the band was getting going, and they hadn't finished the first album yet, and just experiencing some version of success with the Boz tour around Suck Degrees time. And they were already the successful studio trio anyway, with Hungate, Page, and Porcaro in the scene at the time. But something that David Hungate said, just that Boz had no ego or star trip. He was just one of the guys, like in the band, and that made for such a more welcoming and loose atmosphere for when they were working on the tracks. That stuck with me. That fit with my other interpretations of Boz's character. But I liked hearing that from him, who had worked with him.
What's the next book? Is it Toto? What are you thinking about?
I have two ideas I'm working with, and I'm just kind of waiting to see which one takes the upper hand. I have two projects in progress, and I hope to soon announce one of them anyway.
How did he get the nickname Boz?
Well, that's an interesting story, and kind of like not a bit. Well, it was kind of an accident sort of thing at a high school party. I believe it was the St. Mark's prep school era where Steve Miller was too, that some student kind of called William Roy Scaggs Bosley as a joke. Like, aren't you Bosley kind of thing, just totally random. And the name stuck around school and people just started calling him Bosley Boz. So it just stuck. But I believe in a later interview that I studied, Boz said if he could consciously choose his stage name that wasn't William Royce, he would have picked something else probably. But it's very catchy. It's unique in retrospect, I think.
What do you think of the yacht rock thing? What's your take on it?
I feel like it's minimizing a bit the yacht rock term. It makes it immediately the work it's talking about very light and very thin and kind of like just this party music in a way. But it has a point in terms of the light and easy feeling that's suggested by the genre / songs that are attached to it. So I have mixed feelings about it. I don't like using it too much in writing anyway, the term, but some of Boz's music can theoretically fit in there. And in the documentary that came out recently, I think the Silk Degrees records mentioned or it comes up at a certain point. And it's, the players too, like the Toto guys that are on a lot of those records that are called yacht rock records, helped create that sound in part just by playing. So I have mixed feelings about it. It's not my favorite term because I feel like it restricts, but I get it. I get what it's going for.
That's only part one of our conversation with Jude Warne. We'll have more coming up the next week. Remember, if you want to help the channel, there's a PayPal link where you can make a donation. Also, join our Patreon. You'll get early access to hundreds of clips that have not really been on YouTube yet. We're just loading so many clips on there that we haven't had a chance or time to post. And they're great, juicy things on the history of rock and roll. These are all interviews that you'll love. For $6 and change, you'll get access to all these clips right now. Link in the description. Also, buy a cap from Rock History Music, a t-shirt, a jacket, or a tank top. We've got all of it at our swag store via Teespring. It's good quality stuff. Again, all the links in the description. When you subscribe to our channel, make sure you click the bell notification so you don't miss anything. Like our videos, comment on them, and please share them on social media in the appropriate groups. We'd appreciate that. It makes a big difference. I'm John Bowden. This is Rock History Music. Take good care of yourself, and thanks for watching.